going to give a couple minutes to get started here, just to let everybody kind of settle in. We still have some people, looks like, that are joining, so we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Go ahead and get started. My name is Katie, and I am the Events and Projects Coordinator here at the Michigan Center for Youth Justice. And we are joined by our panelists. We're really excited to have everybody here. They have some various backgrounds in restorative justice. Really great to be talking about that. So we'll get into that. First, I'm going to do just a little bit of introductions of everybody, define, what restorative justice is. Then we'll go into asking questions of our panelists. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end to get some questions from from the attendees, people who have joined. So looking forward to that as well. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us this morning. And hopefully you'll learn something new from our panelists and about restorative justice in general. First, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So Michigan Center for Youth Justice, we would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of all the lands we might find ourselves on today. I know a lot of you might be from the state of Michigan, but could be coming from various other states across the country. The Michigan Center for Youth Justice, we are physically located. Our office is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. So we like to do a land acknowledgement to get us started. First, let's introduce Michigan Center for Youth Justice as an organization for those who might not be familiar with our work. So we are a nonprofit and we advocate for legislative and policy changes to Michigan's juvenile justice system. So statewide in Michigan, or what we call the JJ system sometimes. And our vision is a fair and effective justice system for Michigan's children, youth, and young adults. Here's our staff. We are small but mighty. There's 6 of us here in the office. Jason Smith is our executive director. And then we have Heidi Frankenhauser, who's our deputy director. Danita Dorsey, who is our outreach and advocacy manager. And we also, on the far right there, is Jennifer Peacock. That's our policy director. And Michaela Jones is our communications coordinator. And then there's me. I'm Katie, and the events and projects coordinator, and also be your moderator today. So firstly on the panel, we have Belinda Doolin, and she's the executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center in Washtenaw and Livingston counties. She's been the executive director there since 2007. She has significantly expanded the small claims mediation program, making it the first step for problem solving in the 14A, 14B, and 15th district courts. In addition, she implemented school-based conflict programs to identify and resolve barriers and issues affecting students there, their families, and the staff. Belinda holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in dispute resolution from Wayne State University. Next, we have Christine Gilman. She's the executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center of West Michigan, and she's been the executive director there since 2012. In her role, she oversees community dispute resolution and provides affordable restorative justice and mediation services and trainings. Christine also played a pivotal role in developing a restorative justice program to reduce school suspensions in K-12 schools out there. Christine is a licensed trainer in basic restorative justice practices, using circles effectively, and restorative justice conferences. And those are from the International Institute for Restorative Practices. She has a political science degree in government, and that was her undergraduate degree was from Colby College, and JD from Tulane University. We're also joined today by Kempis, or he goes by Gani, songster, and he is from the Center for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, or CFSY, if you hear me say that. He joined in March and was the first Transformative Healing and Restorative Justice Manager. In this role, he helps CFSY advance transformative and healing justice models throughout the nation. So it's a nationwide organization. Ghani is also the founding member of Right to Redemption, the Redemption Project, and the Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty or Death by Incarceration. Since his release in 2017, after serving 30 years in prison, starting when he was only 15 years old, he emerged as a voice and visionary in Philadelphia's movement to end mass incarceration and to create transformative and restorative responses to harm and violence. Prior to joining CFSY, Ghani spent 3 years at the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project as a leader, and it was the first restorative justice diversion program for youth in Philadelphia, and it was called Healing Futures. We are also joined by a special guest. Her name is Janelle Harvey. She's on the left there in that picture. And so she's a longtime advocate of restorative justice and participated in the Healing Futures program in Philadelphia with Ghani after becoming the victim of a random assault by 5 youth in March of 2021. So after being contacted by Ghani, Janelle agreed to participate in the restorative process. You see that picture there on the right is one of the young people that she had participated with in restorative justice practice there. So time for a poll. We'd like to know, where's everybody coming from? You'll have some options either to say like a region in Michigan that you're from or a region in the United States that you're from. And then also second question, just want to know, how familiar are you with restorative justice and the practices of restorative justice? You know, do you feel really comfortable or do you practice it and work with it every day? Are you just learning about restorative justice practices? So let us know. And I will open the poll for you here in just a moment. All right, so the poll should be launched. You should see it. So I'll give about a minute or so before I end the poll, just to give, you know, a couple of questions or give you just a couple minutes to answer that. All right, going to give you a couple of seconds to answer those questions if you haven't done it already. It looks like a lot of people have answered. All right, awesome. Thanks so much for giving us that information. So it looks like we have a number of people within Michigan. So several from Metro Detroit, Mid-Michigan, and West Michigan. A few from outside of Michigan. So in our Northeast region, New England region, Southern region. So thank you so much for joining us from across the country there. It looks like a lot of people are pretty familiar with restorative justice. We have a few practitioners here, people who are very familiar, some who are familiar but still, might not work with it all the time. And then some who have heard of it and are just learning about it too. So keeping that in mind, I'm actually going to close out the poll and give a little background information about what restorative justice is, how it compares to the traditional justice system. We think of like punitive justice, and then just some history of it. So we'll just briefly go through that. So just basically, what is restorative justice? So it conceives of justice as a repair to a harm caused by a crime or other conflicts. So rather than justice by punishment. I have another slide where it kind of compares and contrasts that we'll look at too. Restorative justice brings those harmed by this crime or conflict and those responsible for the harm, it brings them into communication with each other. So very different from what you might think of as like a traditional court or punitive type system. So it also supports people to recognize that their activities really affect others and that you are responsible for your choices and will be held accountable to them. So the roots of restorative justice, it's traced back to indigenous cultures, some from across the globe. So these are peace or connection circles, justice circles, you might have heard of those terms before. Specifically in North America, the Navajo used peacemaking circles and that type of thing, and embodied both prevention of harm and a response to a harm that was already done. And the core is really of those involved in the contract or the conflict, excuse me, is addressing why it happened in the first place. You know, what circumstances happened where this occurred, how can it be prevented, and an emphasis on restoring the dignity and worth of everybody involved. So that could also involve the entire community at times, just depending on what the circumstances are. And also maintaining accountability and responsibility. So still creating that accountability, but restoring dignity and worth as well. In this practice, we've seen a growth in Western culture as an alternative to mass incarceration, which we've seen over the last several decades. So to compare and contrast restorative justice versus the traditional, more punitive justice that we see or might be more familiar with. So with punitive justice, a crime happens or harm, and it violates the state and its laws. Restorative justice sees it more the crime or conflict as a violation of people and the relationships that people have. Punitive justice is focused more on establishing guilt. So there's a punishment or a sentence that can be determined and then applied. Whereas for justice and restorative justice practices, the focus is really on the needs and obligations, again, of everybody involved. So that could involve the community as well. For punitive justice, the central parties are the state and the defendant, the state versus whoever. You probably might have heard of that before. Whereas in restorative justice, the parties are the victim or the person who was harmed and the individual who caused that harm. And justice in the punitive system, it's really sought through conflict. You can kind of see, if you've ever watched, court TV shows, there's somebody like even in those terms, the defendant versus the state or state versus whoever, there's arguments made in a courtroom, those types of things. So it's really sought through conflict. And then restorative justice is sought through dialogue in agreement between all the parties that are involved. Accountability is also defined differently. So accountability is achieved through punishment in the more punitive or traditional justice system, whereas accountability is achieved in restorative justice through the making of amends. We'll talk about that a lot with our panel, what accountability means and kind of how do we redefine that. So just a couple of tips and housekeeping items before we get started. So the Q&A feature can be used to submit your questions. We will address the questions after the panel. So we have a couple of questions that we'll be asking of our panelists. Once we go through all that, we will address any questions that come from the audience. So please use the Q&A feature, submit questions whenever you think of them, and we can address them right afterwards. Okay, and with that, we will go ahead and get started. See, let me get my questions up further. Again, thank you to everybody for joining us today. Definitely, I know a hard time, for some of us today, but I'm really excited that we're talking about restorative justice. The first question is going to be for all of the panelists. I'd just like to know what drives you to support this work or your approach to restorative justice. Belinda's first on my screen, so I don't know if you wanted to get started.
Sure, why not? Someone has to be first. First, I want to just say good morning to everyone, and I want to thank MCYJ for hosting this panel today, and just acknowledge that I'm taking a collective breath with those who are in the audience, for those of us who are getting through. So just I'm with you there. But I think part of this week's experience is a driver for why I do this. I'm a middle-aged Black woman from an urban city and grew up in a time, coming of age in a time when mass incarceration of young Black males was on the rise. My classmates, my friends, my neighbors were literally disappearing off the streets from the school, and I didn't quite understand why. Fast forward many years, I began to study conflict resolution and understanding the connection between institution systems, policies in my community, and realized that something different could be done. Go beyond that moment, I became a mother of an African American son, and realized how vulnerable he was to a system, a society that did not give him space to make silly, silly decisions, make mistakes and learn from it and recover. A society that would label him for the rest of his life. So those are the things that the lived experiences that I had that motivated me to get more involved with the work and beyond the practitioners level of bringing people together, which is absolutely important. But I have the opportunity and a platform that allows me to dig deep and to challenge our court systems and institutions and the prosecutor and elected officials and those around me who are connected to the system, police agencies. So I feel like I need to use my superpower for good, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Belinda. Next, I have Gani. So same question to you. What drives your support for this work?
Oh, yeah, greetings everyone. And I want to begin by just echoing, the gratitude, Belinda's gratitude to Michigan Center for Youth Justice, especially, to you, Katie and Heidi, for creating a space to have the conversation we're having at this particular time too. Shout out also to my CFSY colleagues, Catherine Jones and Eddie Ellis, for looping me in and connecting me with MCYJ for this opportunity. So my drive to support this work or this approach to restorative justice is born out of a particular lived experience, kind of like Linda's experience. And it's a perspective that's born out of that experience. And as much as I tire about that, sharing and talking about that experience and talking about it is literally tiresome because of the weight of it, I know it's important to share, at least share the lessons that come from it, because I believe that those lessons can offer an important and maybe even transformative and empowering perspective. So I come before you today, not as an expert, first of all, on anything, but as a witness. And so I'm offering not an analysis, but a bearing of witness. And I join you today a month and a half away from my 7th year back in the wide open world. After 30 years of incarceration that began in 1987, at the age of 15. At that time, I was directly involved in an irreversible harm, a loss of a human life. And I was sentenced to life in prison, or what is more aptly known by many as death by incarceration at that age. And I'm only here because of a series of U.S. Supreme Court rulings beginning in 2012 with Miller versus Alabama, and then reinforced by Montgomery versus Louisiana, that said that it's unconstitutional to sentence children to mandatory life without parole. My drive is born from a deep personal conviction, right? And an awareness about how antithetical to accountability the system really is. When I was apprehended by the police, the first words that were uttered to me was, "Anything you say can and will be used against you." And those words are uttered to every person accused or apprehended for causing harm. And where truth-telling is a very important part of the restorative justice process, it's a very important part of accountability. That's something that's instantly dissuaded by those words. Anything you say can and will be used against you. That's what we're told. Truth telling, owning up to what we did, is going to be highly consequential. And I'm not here speaking as an innocent person. There are a lot of people who I know are innocent, a lot of children who are innocent. There are a lot of people who have the spectrum of responsibility is broad, right? I'm speaking about people who are incarcerated, people who've caused harm. We're not monolithic. I'm speaking for myself. My first visit from my mother, she brought 3 books with her for me. The autobiography of Malcolm X, the autobiography of Nelson Mandela, and Mark Mathabana's Kaffir Boy. And as I opened those books and read them, they exploded my brain cells. You know, they opened me up to bigger struggles in the world that people all over the world were mired in. And it shamed me about the puerile and wayward and selfish pursuits that I was on as a child. And it whet an appetite in me for more knowledge. And I would go on to gorge myself on countless books. And I would develop an analysis about world affairs, a geopolitical analysis even, right? An analysis on violence, on industrial violence, structural violence, wars, and all of these kind of things. But I had not yet come to terms with the role that I had played in violence. I had developed a critique about violence by other systems and by other people. I had even developed a critique about the violence that I saw taking place, the kind of violence that I took part in my community, and how it was destroying my community. But I still hadn't come to terms. I still didn't account for my role in that. And that would take years for me to develop a sense of self-accounting, right? And I would only develop that through learning about restorative justice, learning about transformative justice and healing justice, and how accountability it would be an important part to developing my own executive functions, right? That frontal lobe, that underdeveloped frontal lobe, you know, that all children and all development human beings, that phase that we go through, learning how to account for our own actions is an important muscle to build to becoming fully human. And that is something that the system from your very first contact with it gets in the way of. Then you meet your lawyers and your lawyers tell you, don't say anything, I got you. And you watch your lawyers put on the best performance for you. And if you win or lose the case, right? If you win the case and you walk, what have you really learned in terms of your own personal development? And then when you go to prison like me, I would go on to still advocate for my own innocence in the appellate process, even though I knew I wasn't innocent, right? However, even if I learned about accountability, to account for my harms would be highly consequential. And so, you know, the importance of a process for people who really want to tell the truth, who really want to grow and really want to become agents of change in their community, who really want to assume responsible for what they had done, who really want to redeem themselves, right? And transform and redeem themselves and enter the good graces of their community and society and the world at large. You know, the legal process that had apprehended us and that we were confined to and that we had to reckon with really gets in the way of that. And so that's what drives my passion, my commitment to advocate for a model that would allow for true accountability. And accountability, not just owning up to things, but where young people like myself can truly become empowered, right? To not replicate the harms that had happened to us, right? But also become agents of change in our community and help other young people from going down the paths that we had went down, from making the mistakes that we had made, right? That type of accountability is definitely no avenue for that is created by the system. In fact, the system is antithetical to that. And so that's the witnessing, the observation, the perspective, and the analysis that gives rise to my drive for a different kind of system and process for addressing harm.
Thank you, Gani. Yeah, we'll talk a lot about accountability, but we're so glad that we got connected with you and you're able to join us. Next, I have Christine from the DRC in West Michigan. So same question, what drives your support for the work?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Michigan Center for Youth Justice and making time for this conversation. I think it's more important today than we even thought it would be when we were planning this all this time. In a nutshell, after working in the legal system for 20 years and seeing just how our criminal legal system takes harm and compounds it, how our other disciplinary systems take harm and create more harm, I see restorative practices as a way to turn that harm into growth, healing, and understanding. And really, that's just what drives me to this work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much for joining us. Lastly, Janelle, same question. What kind of sparked your support for restorative justice and wanting to get involved?
Hi, everyone. To start, I think Michigan and CSFY, YASP, and all the other organizations who are advocating for this effort. So for many years, especially in my early young adulthood, I had an interest in topics like social justice, criminal justice, and a lot of it stemmed from me being in my youth and observing some things that I didn't understand. And I was always an individual who cared more about justice through empathy and communication with different groups of individuals. And as I got older, I grew a dislike for the general criminal justice system because I felt like they were very apathetic and continue to be, because most times in the criminal justice system, they are worried about hastily finding an offender for crimes. And a lot of times they don't use the resources or feel that resources are not necessary to try to understand why a lot of crimes are committed, especially among youth. And as Godin pointing out, youth aren't fully developed, which plays a role in why a lot of behaviors that are not socially acceptable do take place. And I believe that restorative justice is better because maybe, foundations can grow so that the first idea to hold someone accountable is not to put them on death row or not to put them in a prison system where they're now confined with many other individuals who've done heinous crimes and who also don't have resources for mental and behavioral therapies. I feel like that will worsen them. And as far as the youth are concerned, I believe that we have to find a way to connect with them and understand why things are happening. And a lot of times I believe in a separation of behavior versus intent, because I also believe that just because a behavior occurs does not mean a person, well, they intend to do it, but not necessarily because they are at their core or at their character heinous people. There's peer pressure, even among a lot of adults who are at the grown age, but may have had a traumatic experience that stunted their emotional and mental growth at a youthful age. There's peer pressure, there's survival. I believe survival is at the core of a lot of heinous activities, even activities that aren't as terrible. So that's why I support this cause.
Thanks, Janelle. We appreciate your perspective for sure, having a lived experience within restorative justice, and thanks so much for joining us today. So my next question is kind of two parts, talking about or thinking about accountability, and how it's defined either traditionally in the justice system, but how would each of you define, just very briefly, 1 to 2 sentences, how would you define accountability? And then how do you feel thinking about accountability that the restorative justice approach can be more effective than, say, a more traditional punitive approach to justice or accountability? And again, I guess we'll start with Belinda. She's first on my screen.
Sure. Accountability is such a big word. I think it's big and very specific at the same time. Accountability, I define it when the participants in the circle feel satisfied with the outcome. As a circle keeper, we are not to impose our expectations of what accountability looks like for the individuals there. The person who has experienced the harm may define what is needed to feel that the harm doer has been accountable. The person who did the harm may make offerings of accountability, and as a circle keeper, we have to be satisfied for that. When I was thinking about this question, though, and there's a lot of text, and the audience probably knows where to get that information. But what I want to lift up in this question is challenging how we define accountability as a society and as a practitioner, as an advocate. Accountability is not up to us. We want people to be accountable for what they've done, but what it looks like is really up to the participants of that incident, that event, who are impacted by what has happened. And I also want to lift up the idea that success is different from accountability. In our traditional systems, we look at a successful outcome as something that has the punishment, has the penalty, has the 1, 2, 3 steps of fixing it. And that may not be what a survivor of harm wants. Accountability may be that they sat in a space and spoke with the person who hurt them, and they were able to tell their story and talk about how it impacted them, and that's all they need. They may not need anything further. Accountability for a person who did the harm might look like an apology, an acknowledgement of what has been done. It might look like an action step of doing something, but we really have to grapple with the idea of what we define and see as success versus what those who experience harm see as accountability.
Thanks so much, Belinda. And I'll ask the same question for Gani. How do you think, just briefly, you can redefine accountability using, or how you would define accountability, about using RJ principles? And then how do you think it's a little bit more effective approach than maybe typical punishment?
Thanks, Katie. I mean, first of all, I appreciate the title of this webinar, Redefining Accountability. I ascribe to a saying or a quote by an American psychologist, the late Wade Nobles, who said that real power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition as if it's their own. And that's what's really happens with the language that we use. The language that we use, a lot of it is not language of our own, or the definitions of those terms are not even our own, and we've adopted them as our own. We've been using the term accountability or understanding it through the lens of the state's definition of accountability. The state uses the term accountability in a very weaponized way. That's why it's important for us to fight for control over the language that we use, and terms especially like accountability, because accountability has been used to justify the harshest applications of the law, especially on youth. The state uses the term hold people accountable. And I would argue that, not based on my definition, based on the definitions, what seems to be a harmonious understanding of accountability in cultures all around the world, about that accountability is something you cannot hold someone to. Right? It's not something that can be applied or forced or imposed from the outside. Accountability is something that arises from the inside, right? It requires agency. And so if I was to give a definition, and also I want to appreciate you presenting that slide too, Katie, where you showed the difference between restorative justice and the criminal punishment approach. because in one of those bars, it talks about how harm creates, for the state, it creates guilt and blame. For restorative justice, it creates needs and obligations. Needs of the person who was harmed, as well as the person who caused the harm, because in most cases, persons who victimize others have been victimized themselves, as well as the needs of community. And the other part is obligations. When you harm someone, you are obligated to repair the harm as much as possible and make things right. And so if I was to give a definition based on that understanding and based on a global understanding of accountability, it would be, in a sentence or two, accountability is the exercise of one's own desire and agency to fulfill one's obligations, right? And it's not just backward looking, right? Accountability is not just something that addresses harm that happens. It's not about the harmful actions you've caused, but it's a self-accounting for your actions, period, even the actions that you can carry out. So accountability is the exercising of one's desire and agency to fulfill one's obligation, right? In the case of harm, to the person harmed, in the community, to the person harmed, but in the case of yourself, your obligation to your own health and well-being, your own development, right? And your own relationship to the community. And that's harmonious with the global community. In the Judaic traditions, there's a term called cheshbon nefesh, or cheshbon hanefesh, which is self-accounting. In the Hebraic/Jewish traditions, self-accounting or accounting of the soul. In the Islamic traditions, you have muhasaba, right? Which is an accounting, a self-accounting, reflecting on one's own actions throughout the day. In Theravada Buddhist traditions, accountability is also an internal thing. In the Christian tradition or the Christian belief system, accountability is taking responsibility for one's actions and accepting help from God and from the community in accomplishing what's right. So accountability is entirely, right, an internal process that requires agency. It's not something that somebody can be held to. We cannot hold someone accountable. We can support someone in being accountable. And while harming someone is natural, we've been harming each other since time immemorial. It's just a fallibility of the human condition that we still have to evolve out of. But accountability is not that natural. Accountability, you have to guide someone to accountability. We have to show young people how to account for their actions, right? And so again, accountability is the exercise of one's desire and agency to fulfill one's obligations. In the case of harm, to the person harmed, in the community that you've harmed, but in a general sense, in an everyday sense, to account for one's own health and well-being, one's own journey, one's relationship to the community, just your obligations overall. That is what accountability is. And the state's process disempowers a person. Punishment robs a person of the power to be accountable. It infantilizes the person or the child. It does not allow the child the necessary role that self-accounting plays in becoming a more mature and responsible human being.
Thank you, Gunny. I appreciate that you bring up community and how important it is to involve the community in restorative justice practices. A lot of times harms can be done to the community as a whole as well. So thanks for bringing that up. And Christine's next. So what do you think about what is accountability and how is restorative justice practices and how that definition of accountability might be a better or more effective approach than the punitive measures?
I think about accountability as taking responsibility in context of what occurred, and that it's about repair, not retribution. And I'd give a +1 to what Belinda said. I mean, accountability occurs when the people in the circle get what they need. I I think one of the biggest problems that we're facing is we don't really have a way to focus out yet and hold our systems of oppression that put many people in the situations that lead to harm. We don't have a way to hold those systems accountable, and to dismantle those systems yet. Why do I think it's more effective than retributive? I mean, again, the retributive system requires that we punish people who cause harm, and in that sense harm them more. And as Gani said, the retributive system really robs people of a chance to be accountable, to, you know, in a sense, earn their way back into the community. And one really important part of a restorative process is that it gives those that are harmed a voice. It allows them to express to the people that harmed them how they were harmed, gives them an opportunity to ask questions that may be getting in the way of their healing. You know, why me? Why did this happen? Whatever the questions are, they have an opportunity to ask them. And an opportunity to get some or all of those needs met, and move towards their own healing and coming back into the community.
Thank you so much, Christine. Oh, Gani, did you put your hand up?
I did, but I know Janelle didn't go yet. So, but I do want to add something to it after Janelle goes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So Janelle, and how would you define accountability? And with your experience, did you think it was a better, more effective way to deal with, harms that have been caused than maybe a traditional punitive system?
So in this circumstance, accountability to me is for the individuals responsible for the events to try to understand the difference between their behavior versus their intent, but also to try to understand how they may have negatively impacted the individuals involved, and not only the persons harmed, but also the impact on themselves and the impact on individuals who are closely associated with them. And I believe that restorative justice is a much more effective effort than punitive justice, because as Christine and Gani said, it allows room for growth for both the person harmed and the individuals who were the cause of that harm. And it allows them to grow in a space that is not restricted by too much time, or not restricted, or doesn't restrict, their way of communicating efforts, because the person's harmed, they do have questions. And as someone mentioned earlier, all it takes is, I believe it was you, Belinda, all it takes for some individuals is to understand why they were harmed. Because a lot of us who are harmed, we have families. Like me, I'm the mother of a daughter who's almost 5, and I am now the aunt of a young Black male who is 10, who, is having personal grievances in his home, and he hasn't had legal trouble, but he's having trouble academically. And so I understand, because I'm there with him, his emotional and behavioral needs and his mental needs, and the restoration that he will need to prevent him from being in a punitive system. And to me, it's a very broad spectrum that has to be a collaborative effort.
Thank you so much, Janelle, for giving your perspective on that accountability, but just everyday life that we might see even with our own kids, how restorative practices can be used. Gani, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and I don't know, it just bursting to come out of me. I'm not sure if this is the right time or place, but I just wanted to share. Yesterday, someone asked me, in what ways will or could the election change, or what could the election change about my work, right? And what would stay the same? And initially, I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure the election is going to change much about my work, you know. But then I had kind of like a Dr. Martin Luther King sort of dilemma, you know, where like he became increasingly self-critical about asking, specifically his dilemma later on in life was about asking nonviolence of oppressed communities in a country that is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So too, you know, I have to consider now in my work with young people gripped up by the criminal punishment system for causing or being accused of causing harm, how I talk with them about personal accountability, and more importantly, why accountability is important and the right exercise of their agency when they have witnessed over and over the course of perhaps their entire young lives how lack of accountability or lack of even a willingness to account for one's harmful words and acts is for some rewarded with the highest positions of power and prestige. So how I think I'll have to get more creative, right? With how I explain to young people, right, why the lack of accountability is not the example to follow. And what
Thank
will
you,
stay the
Kim. Yeah.
same about my work, by the way, because the question is what will change and what will stay the same. What will stay the same is the clarity of purpose and the urgency with which I do it. And so I just wanted to, since we were on the piece about accountability, it's just something that I wrestled with as recent as yesterday about accountability.
Thank you for bringing that up. I actually like what you said about creativity. I think we could, we talk about that a lot here at MCYJ too. Like, how can we approach have more creative solutions to things that aren't residential or detention centers, like, or traditional means. So creativity also very important. The next question is about communities and how we can get communities involved. So how do each of you think a community can get involved with teaching our young people and our youth about accountability in a way that, is outside of the justice system, that doesn't require them to be involved in a punitive measure or going into a court system or things like that? So again, I'll start with.
Sure. It's a timely question for me at the DRC, because we are putting some efforts and energy and resources into that audience, our young people. And when I say young people, I mean kids as well as young adults as well. Just understanding the brain science more and understanding the development of our executive functioning. We have broaden how we look at the youth and young populations respectfully. I'm not, we don't want to be harmful or disrespectful in that vein, but we want to take a special approach to those members of our community. So one of the things that we're in looking at the framework of how we execute service to them, we want to create spaces for them to just be themselves and to talk openly and honestly about what's going on with them. We decided as an organization, as old folks, grown folks, people who've been in the trenches for a long time, that this is the time that we take a step back and we listen. We're not here to wag a finger and tell. We're here to listen and to get their voice into developing and co-creating a model of circling and restorative conversations and dialogue that speaks to them specifically and directly, something that they can feel ownership and investment in themselves emotionally. So that's one thing that we're going to test to see if that works and if that draws people in. We also want to give them space to talk about what is conflict to them. When I think back over my lifetime in the geography where I worked, we had to say where I was born and lived. I'm sorry, not where I worked, but where I lived. I'm from an urban city, and it was hard to to talk about conflict in constructive and empathetic ways. I think Janelle talked about that as she was thinking about this work. She wanted empathy. We had to be hard. You had to fight. You had to know how to fight. I come from an era where going home in tears was not acceptable. You better get out there and do the fight. Even if you get beat up, you better try. And of course, we know that violence has intensified over the years. And I'm not trying to marginalize or dumb down or water down the impact of the violence that we're experiencing in many communities, particularly communities of color. But when we were thinking about how do we create this space and this dialogue, one question that comes to mind is, how do they perceive conflict? How do they perceive that aspect? How do we normalize it and neutralize the concept of conflict so that we can accept that it's just a part of being? It's how we respond and move forward that creates, that feeds systems, right? That feeds the punitive systems that we're fighting against now. So one approach that we want to use as a teaching approach is one, to be listeners and to be co-creators with systems and models that young people can buy into and feel committed to and grow with them in their learning and understanding. And I want to, humbly say, also learn from them. I believe young people can teach us a whole lot. I believe we could write books about their lived experiences and what they've tried, what they've tested. As harmful as it may sound, they have been testing their own tactics and strategies to address conflict, not thinking about the impact maybe, not thinking about those long-term consequences, but thinking about, in that moment, how do I feel? And if we begin to dissect that, like we dissect so many other things in our society, but giving them the space and agency to dissect what they really were feeling, how did they feel in that moment, the immediate moments afterwards, we may learn something. And how do we, as a society, as a community, shift and pivot so that we can give them more support as they learn to navigate conflict? And I'll also add that, and this may be, in relation to what I'm feeling today, we do not have good grown folk models of helping children model how to manage conflict. I'm gonna say that one more time to make sure I didn't mess up my words. Grown folk have not done a good job of creating a model for kids, for our young people, to model, to be constructive in managing their conflict. So we got a lot to learn and a lot of pivoting and shifting and remodeling to do, and we need to work with them. We don't need to do it to them or for them. We need to work with them so that we can all be in this together. This is a journey. This restorative work is a journey. It's a movement, and we must include everyone, and especially our grown folks. I say that as a person who needs to get prepared to pass this on. And I'm happy and excited about that. But I need young people to be on board, and we gotta do the work to help them do that.
Thank you so much, Melinda. I like saying this and listening, something that seems very simple, but it's something that's just listen, about experiences and see kind of how far that goes. So next I have Christine. So same question, like how can communities get involved in, using restorative justice principles, or using this type of work, outside of the punitive system to really help young people?
I mean, community members can advocate and support the use of restorative practices in schools and in the criminal legal system and really all of our other systems. I mean, I think one of the best ways to do that is to learn more about restorative practices. I mean, you can take a whole training, which would be awesome, but you can also read books and talk to practitioners. I mean, Belinda said we haven't done a good job of creating a model, and I completely agree with that. And one of the ways we can help to repair that is to learn how to engage in restorative dialogue to build, strengthen, and repair relationships when things go on, and to practice it I mean, I think it is a constant battle for myself. I mean, I'm ingrained in the retributive system, like many of us are, and it's hard. Like the fallback is to go to communicate in the style of punishment, but we really have to step back and engage with people. You know, ask that what happened and try to get to the root of the issue. And the more people, the more those that are really adopting that restorative way of being, the more we will be able to create a model for our youth so that they take that and run with it. So that's what I have to suggest.
Thank you so much, Christine. We did have somebody from the attendees in the audience that said, say that again, models are so important. So yes, I'm glad we're bringing that up. It's very important to, model maybe the behaviors that you would like to see as well. So thank you for bringing that up as well. And Gani, what are your thoughts on how to get communities involved, or how can communities be involved with using restorative practices, especially when you talk about, accountability and maybe holding youth accountable?
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely, I mean, restorative justice, transformative justice, healing justice is community-based to begin with. One of the pillars, one of the values of restorative justice is community, right? And so I think we need to start with that and be very clear about the seminal role that community plays in restorative justice, so that we don't allow restorative justice to become this thing defined in connection with systems. And now it's important to do restorative justice diversion, that's system adjacent kind of restorative justice, because the system has all the bodies and we have to rescue folks, you know what I'm saying, get them out of the system's grip, by all means. But restorative justice at its core is community-centered. You know what I'm saying? So we need to start doing this circle processes in the church, using circle processes to resolve harm on all kind of levels. You know what I'm saying? From serious situations to arguments, right? To get our community back into the culture of resolving our trespasses against each other, big and small, without bringing the system in it, without calling the police, without getting the courts involved, right? And that's not being soft on crime. It's actually doing the hard work of building our own agency again as a community to the system, right? Because we and we have to redefine what justice is, right? Because over the decades, we've kind of like acquiesced to this concept of justice, this new concept of justice, as this thing that's hoarded in these edifices, whether we call them city halls or criminal justice centers, right? Justice is this thing that's stored in these buildings that we have to go to get rationed out to us when we trespass against others' humanity. We go to these buildings and then justice is rationed out to us after harm is done. After harm is done and it's too late, and then now we have to get into the business of repair. And in some cases, the harm cannot be repaired, like in the case of my harm. It cannot be reversed, right? And right now, as we speak, somewhere, someone is about to be harmed. Someone was just harmed, right? In all kind of ways. We don't know. We'll turn on the news later on tonight and we'll see it, right? And so our concept of justice has to think about, okay, well, how do we prevent that, right? How do we create a culture that reduces the likelihood of violence and victimization in our communities, that makes it no longer a characteristic of our communities? So justice is also not just on the back end after harm is done. Justice is like what Dr. Cornel West said. I like that definition of what love looks like in public. How we greet each other, meet each other, and treat each other, the kind of culture that we create. And that's very community-based. So we have to get in the habit of using circle processes, right, to create that kind of culture again in the churches, in the masjids, in the rec centers, in the schools, right? And that's before we even bring the system into it, right, and set up restorative justice diversion processes. Now, if we want to get into how we do restorative justice diversion, that's an entirely next level to the conversation, because the system has the bodies, and right now models are being set up all around the country for restorative justice diversion, or how we extract some of those bodies from the system and bring them into a restorative justice process where the system is not involved, and then the outcome is truly healing and restorative without handcuffs and cages being involved, and without police and prosecutors and judges being involved.
Thank you so much, Gunny. Thank you for bringing up that really took me back. You said soft on crime. I remember that from for anybody who's younger than me that's joining. That was big in the 80s, 90s. Even today still, you had to be hard on crime. That was public safety issue number one was, if you were, or, the punitive measures were what you needed to do. Otherwise, you were soft on crime. So I remember that a lot of that going on and being said. Same question to you, Janelle. How do you think communities can get involved, either using your experience, that you've had with restorative justice, but how can communities kind of get involved in restorative justice measures and, keeping youth out of the more punitive system?
So I think in addition to the adult role models, as Belinda mentioned, and the schools, as Christine mentioned, and the overall community, as Ghani mentioned, I noticed that a lot of community health centers seem to be very supportive about, trying to procure and distribute resources for different needs of individuals. So I think getting community centers involved in understanding restorative justice would be a very significant effort. And, getting them the resources to educate individuals who come to them for care. And I like to focus on the behavioral health clinic. I work in a behavioral health clinic, and I am noticing that, especially among children and younger individuals, the stigma against the need for therapy and diagnoses that may require medication management and collaboration with therapy is gradually declining. So with that decline, we're getting more individuals who are being referred for behavioral and mental services. But I also noticed that a lot of behavioral practitioners do have an obligation that when a client confides in them about harming themselves or potentially feeling like they want to harm somebody else, they're required to inform law enforcement, which that's reasonable because most times you don't want to take your chances. But, I believe that sometimes that violates the provider-patient trust. So if they have more access to the resources, they have more education on, the needs of individuals who may benefit from restorative justice, we can build that trust. Maybe practitioners will grow less hasty to want to inform law enforcement about the thoughts of an individual, and that may aid in building a community, where we can send individuals to others to talk to about their thoughts or needs. And, in an event that they have a historic track record of harming themselves or individuals, then restorative justice, it's the option rather than punitive justice.
Thank you, Janelle, for actually bringing up mental health services. Those are so important. And we could probably have a whole nother panel talking about it. It's so important, especially for everybody, but especially for youth, in addressing some of the harms that may have occurred. Mental health is very important to that conversation. I have a couple of individual questions for everybody. So, and then after that, I think we'll transition into some of our audience Q&A. But I'd like to start with Christine. And so you have done work at reducing school suspensions, I know, at the DRC in West Michigan. So I wanted to see, can you share how you effectively integrated this approach and that mindset into a school-based setting, so actually putting it to, public schools, K through 12 schools.
It's been a growing process. I mean, I'm sure as everyone knows, I mean, teachers and school administrators have so much on their plate that often, someone comes up with the idea they're going to bring restorative practices and they just think it's the next program that the school is bringing through. So, I mean, we're really trying to work on the idea that it's not the next thing, like it's the plate, it's the way to support all of those other things that you have to do. We're really working hard with our partners to get all of the people in the buildings fully trained and trying to kind of everyone, when people think about restorative processes in schools, they think of circles, and we're trying to get them to go back to more basic than that. Also, like just to that effective communication, how do you communicate with someone? How do you have a restorative conversation? How can you to build those relationships and strengthen them so that when things go wrong, you have a little more a better foundation to resolve things. I mean, we've just really been working on that, and it takes a lot of time, and it's challenging. I know Belinda knows. I mean, it's challenging because there's so much turnover, and you feel like as many people as you train, there are new people coming through. But I think it's really trying to encourage and coach the teachers and administrators and other people in the schools about that proactive piece and making their spaces really, a community that students want to be in and feel safe in. And I think it's going to continue to be a journey, but that's the way we're trying to tackle it.
It's a good point. Yeah, definitely a journey, because it's can be very different than what people are used to, especially dealing with conflicts in a school setting, especially recently with, events that have occurred within school settings. So definitely restorative practices could be useful for sure in those types of areas. So thanks so much, Christine. And then next question I have is for Janelle. I know agreeing to meet with the young people through the Healing Futures program, it was probably a very big decision for you at the time. But now that you've done it, how do you think the restorative justice process changed your view of this concept of accountability compared to what you might have thought before or in the traditional justice sense?
So to be honest, it didn't affect my perception of accountability much, because like I mentioned earlier, these efforts had always been a strong interest of mine, and I didn't always think that the punitive system should always be a first strategy to making individuals causing harm or doing any other unjust thing, excuse me, holding them accountable. But overall, it was a wonderful experience, because for me in that moment, accountability was from Daniel's end. It was him showing up, whether he was mentally prepared to, because some people can show up but not fully be prepared to. They're just physically there in a moment, but whether he was or not, his participation mattered. For me, accountability was me agreeing to show up with him, but me also understanding that there was a reason for why he either behaved how he did or why he was in that environment. Because I believe, if I remember correctly, he said he was not one of the individuals who participated in my attack, but he was there. In most groups, most individuals are judged guilty by association. So, and then for us to be there together, we were not although we had the space for a limited time, different from the punitive system, we weren't really restricted. We could say what we wanted. We can cry, scream, cuss, and that was vital for me. I mean, none of that happened. It was a really loving environment, and his mother was there and everyone was there. So we were able to articulate our feelings about the event. And I honestly believe that Daniel did experience, accountability from his end. I hope he did, but it seems like he did.
Wonderful. Yeah, from what I understand, yeah, accountability was kind of achieved through that particular situation, which is, vital when you're using restorative justice. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And Gani, kind of similar. I know you had started the Healing Future programs that Janelle participated in. So my question for you is, do you have any recommendations for people who are trying to create restorative justice programming or use it in a place where it's not really available right now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Katie, for that question. And just hearing Janelle's testimony brings back a lot of memories for me because I co-facilitated that case with her and Daniel. Her and Daniel's case was one of the first cases that we received at Healing Futures. We launched the program May 2021, and her and Daniel's case came to us from the district attorney's office in June the following month. And just to give a little bit of context so that when I answer the question about recommendations, people understand why I'm recommending what I'm recommending. We do restorative justice diversion, Healing Futures, and that's where the district attorney's office refer cases to us of young people who were apprehended for certain harms and they're facing certain charges. We would then reach out to the young person to set up a meeting with them to see if an enrollment meeting to see if they want to participate in the program. And then if they agree, they would have to sign a bunch of papers. They would come with their parents or caregiver, of course. And then if they agree, we work out the schedule for their participation. And then we reach out to the person harmed. And Janelle was the person harmed in this case. We would also receive, as part of the referral packet, a redacted police report describing the harm. And of course, the police report is devoid of context. You know what I'm saying? And so we take it with a grain of salt because harm is usually a complex thing that has all kind of nuances and it has rabbit holes that we would have to go down with the young person and the person harmed to see where they lead us and what the roots of the harm is. Anyway, when the young person agreed to participate in the program, it would be 8 weeks or so of preparation, meeting with the young person once a week to prepare them to come face to face with the person that they've harmed. In this case, preparing Daniel to come face to face with Janelle in a circle process, a very intimate circle process, where Daniel would get to hear from Janelle how his actions impacted her, he would hear from his own mother, how his actions impacted his mother and his family, and the two community members who weren't directly involved or connected to the harm, but they're invested in the health and well-being of the community, they would also be there. And Daniel would get to hear from them as well. And then he would get to the responsible youth. In this case, in Janelle's case, it was Daniel they would get to offer an apology or an accountability statement that they'd been working on over the course of 8 weeks. Then everybody would huddle up and come up with a restorative plan for how the young person would repair the harm. That plan might last anywhere from 2 to 7 months. After the plan is completed, we would let the district attorney's office know, then the case would be closed. No criminal record would be entered. The charges would be declined, like if they never existed. Nothing could later on haunt this young person's ability to get employment, an apartment, or a college education later on. Then we would have a community celebration for each case. And the picture that you had up on the screen earlier, Kate, was the picture that was taken at Janelle's and Daniel's community celebration. where they embraced and they were awarded with plaques. I think Janelle's plaque was for love of community, and Daniel's was for transformation and accountability. To do a program like this, and it's very impactful, I think Healing Futures have done over 40-something cases. I would recommend for anybody wanting to set up a restorative justice diversion program like this to connect with Equal Justice USA. Equal Justice US, yes, the team at Equal Justice USA were the ones who trained us at Healing Futures. And they've been training community-based organizations all around the country to set up restorative justice diversion programs. So the restorative justice diversion program is usually 3 entities. It would be the community-based organization that's hosting the program, the referring agency, whether it's the district attorney's office, the courts, or the probation office, and the third would be the team at Equal Justice USA, or the trainers, who's training in the model of restorative justice diversion. So my recommendation would be to connect with Equal Justice USA. Well, if you're a part of an organization or you know of an organization in your city that you think can host or should host a program like this, getting that organization connected with Equal Justice USA, and then together finding out who or what could be the referring agency in your city, whether it's the courts, the district attorney's office, or the probation office, and then let that relationship, continue to develop. But that would be my recommendation. Reach out to Equal Justice USA, as well as Common Justice. Common Justice, they started the first ever restorative justice diversion program in the country, but for adults. But it would be important to connect with Common Justice because they do a practitioner's lab too. That's where I'm at right now, where they train people in how to do this kind of work. And I would strongly recommend everybody read Daniel Sered's book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Because Daniel Sered is the founder and director of Restorative Justice, and her book is one of the pillars, I would say, of understanding the carceral process and the restorative justice diversion process. Contact EJ USA, Common Justice, read Daniel Sered's Until We Reckon, and find out what you want, which agency or institution in your city you want to be the referring agency for your restorative justice diversion programs.
Thank you so much, Tony. Those are great suggestions. I like that you incorporated in Healing Futures like a celebration. Once the case, that kind of comes to an end, that's a really great compliment. And yeah, there's a lot of resources out there, especially written resources, a lot of books, a lot of articles that have been written about restorative justice. So those are great places to start if anybody wants to even just learn more about what restorative justice is. So for Belinda, I would like to ask, so in your work, what role does equity really play, in restorative justice and just the work that you do in general? And how are you able to ensure that in mediation, dispute resolution practices, they're all accessible and fair, especially within the community talk?
This is, and I think an important question. It's also a heavy question. Just in general. So I will start my answer, and I know that the other panelists will have some responses as well. So if they do, please add to it. But I'm starting my answer by referencing Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, a book that I read, I don't know, when it first came out, and I'm not sure how many years ago that was, but there's a part of the book, a quote or a statement in the book where he says, where he makes a statement that challenged me personally, that basically said, will I be the custodian of the status quo? When you look at our systems and mass incarceration and the inequities and the disparities and the disproportionalities, when you look at that, then I read the statement to say, will I be the custodian of the status quo? So one part of my answer is to do that self-examination. and really understand what these inequities and disparities and what it means and how it impacts people, especially marginalized people. And another nuance to this to your question, Katie, for me was the notion of how easy it is to marginalize people that we deem marginal in our society. We just maintain that status quo. He must be a bad kid because he's been to the principal's office multiple times. That must be a ratchet family because they are all, you know, historically and generationally, they were in trouble. The police are called. So it's easy for us to label people and marginalize people that we deem marginal. And I think that's that self-reflection and self-work that we have to do as well. The other part of this was just the acknowledgement that in this work, even in this work, we can duplicate those disparities that our criminal legal system has produced. It's easy to do that. So we build partnerships with components of our system. Donnie has said with your DA, your district attorney, your prosecutor, police, probation officers, and all of those folks. And that is okay. Those partnerships are important, but ask yourself, who's missing? Who's missing from that table? Are they on the menu of your agenda, or are they at the table helping to co-create a model or interrupt a system that is harming them in their community? We have to be willing and brave and courageous enough to say who's missing from the table. And I want to, and when we think about the inequities, and I think about building trust, how do we build trust from those individuals who traditionally don't get to be at these tables? That is one way of moving away from inequity to making it more equitable. We create access to the conversation. We create access to understanding restorative practice work. We create access to getting folks trained to be circle keepers, ordinary people living ordinary lives. We create access for them. And those folks who traditionally are not a part of creating this work, right? Ghani said that part of his organization was helping people be change agents. Then you have Janelle here. You have Daniel on the front line being advocates for them. Traditionally, they probably would not have been asked to this table, but we create that access for them. We have the power to do that. And we learn and grow and create together, which is incredibly important. The other part of this is data-driven. What does the data have? What is the current data, and how you break that down and pull it apart and help everyone at the table understand that data. Don't leave it to one or two mouthpieces. One of the things that we challenge ourselves at our DRC is that when we enter a new program, we're talking to the chief judge, we're talking to the person in charge of this and a person in charge of that. What we've learned is that the people on the front line need to be just equally empowered and feel a sense of ownership of these new systems and programs that we're trying to develop. We cannot leave them out. Sometimes they are the gatekeeper to the information that we need in order to create a program. So we have to be thoughtful and mindful about that. And the last thing that I would say, that's something that is incredibly important to our work here in Washtenaw County, is that everyone is invited. It's a big tent. The good thing about restorative models and systems is that it's big enough to include everybody. And when I say everybody, I'm talking across all identities, including those returning to the community from the carceral system. Our returning systems are an important component for this. They have lived through something. The Ghanis of our society are, to me, are wonderful mouthpieces of advocates, ambassadors, facilitators, trainers, the whole bit. So invite them to the table as well. So this is a big enough tent to include everyone, and yet it can be so specific that we can talk about harm and conflict management very specifically. So when I think about equity, we think about the parents, the youth, community members, the grandmothers, the aunties, the uncles in the community, the preachers, the faith leaders of the community. Circles can happen anywhere on your front porch. If you're a trusted individual in your community and you provide the snack to the kids when they get off the bus, you can circle up on your porch, in your backyard, in your home. If you are the faith leader at the little congregation at the end of the block, you can create space for this work. If you are corporate America and you have an empty conference room that is not being used, you can partner with the community center and you can offer that space for safe circles. So this tent is big enough for everyone. And the way this work thrives in an equitable way is to make sure that everyone is knowledgeable, updated, educated, and included, so that this can be a community-based effort to shift justice and redefine what accountability is in ways that folks who are harmed, they have another pathway to healing. So that's what the challenge of the equity question is, and we play a big role in creating equity in a system that has traditionally been inequitable.
Thank you so much for that, Belinda. Especially what you said about, creating space. If it doesn't exist, we can create it and create a space where everybody is included. Even people who've already been involved in the more traditional justice system, restorative practices can be important for that as well. So thank you so much for those insights. So the last question I have for the panel before I want to go into some of the questions that are coming from our audience. So just very quickly, for everybody, what are some of the barriers to restorative justice or implementing restorative justice that you might have come across within the course of your work or your experiences? And just how can we overcome them? So just briefly stating, how maybe you've overcome some of these challenges. And I can start with Christine.
I think one of the biggest barriers is just that retributive systems are so baked into all of us. I can think of so often, when you ask a student what they need after they've been harmed, and they would say, I want that person suspended. Or I can't remember who was talking about soft on crime. It's that whole like how can this sitting down in a circle, this kumbaya business actually help repair things. So I think getting over that really fundamental hurdle is one of the biggest problems that we have. And I'll just piggyback on that. I think of some of our victim witness supporters had to overcome that sort of the bias against like how victim participation. Why would someone who was harmed by crime want to sit down with that person? And I think we've had a lot of growth just because they've seen a lot of examples over time about how participating in the process can really help someone who was harmed heal. So.
You, Christine. Yeah, it can be a very big decision to sit down with somebody who's caused you harm and really hear them out. And it's not always right for everybody, depending on the circumstances. So definitely takes some thinking about. So thanks for mentioning that. And then Janelle, what were, some of your, what were some of the barriers maybe you had yourself or that you've seen in the process of supporting this work, and how can we overcome?
So one that I see is a lot of older individuals holding on to old ideas that are still being passed down to younger generations. For example, my parents and grandparents are very old, and their ideal is you did this, you know what you did, you know right from wrong, as opposed to why did you do this, and trying to understand, the reason behind the behavior, trying to understand if there was something that we, the younger individuals who are impacted by traumatically, that they may not have spoken of. And I think a way to combat that, is trying to broaden the mindsets primarily of individuals who are in this generation, I would say like 40 and younger, I do believe that the mindsets of older individuals can change, but it will be very hard, and it would be more easier to cultivate broader mindsets among younger populations.
Thank you, Janelle. That kind of goes again to what Belinda said earlier about listening, listening to youth and how they can really teach us things. So that's a good point. Thank you. And Gani, yeah, what are some challenges you might face either with, creating restorative circles or in your current job position with CFSY? Are there barriers that you experience? And then just briefly, how might we overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, the barriers are many, and I really saw them as the inaugural program manager of Healing Futures. Not just a lack of familiarity in the community about restorative justice. People just don't know about it. The prevailing concept of justice in the minds of people is, what we grew up with, the criminal punishment system. And so we have to do the hard work of trying to, bring people, just, raise their awareness about another model, another mode of procedure. And right now, the only operational models we have are in small pockets around the country. Restorative Justice Diversion Program done by community-based organizations like Healing Futures with teams of like 3 and 4 people doing the work of 15 and 20 people, underfunded, and we're not getting no money. We never got no money from the state to do this. The city didn't give us any money to do this work, so I just want to address that so people don't think, address that from the door so people don't think that this is something that the city or the state is funding. No, community-based organizations are funding these programs with money that they raise from grants and donations. All right. So funding is a challenge. And that leaves us to, or confines us to, doing this work on a fringe level when what we need to do is scale this work up to an institutional level. All right. And I use the word institution from a Ruth Wilson Gilmore perspective when she talks about abolition being about presence, not absence, about building life-affirming institutions. I would like to see these restorative justice diversion be scaled up to the level of life-affirming institutions, but right now we're just done in small pockets, scraping along with the funds that we can muster up. I remember, when one case happened, this was the case that where a group of African-American youth had assaulted a group of Asian-American youth at a SEPTA train station in Philadelphia. And the case had become real popular. And some organizations that heard about Healing Futures, some Asian American and Pacific Island organizations such as Asian American United, Viet Lead, the Warriors Society, they reached out to us because they wanted us to do restorative justice diversion for this program. I mean, for this case. And it was an entirely eligible case based on the criteria, but we were not allowed to get that case because of how political it is. You know what I'm saying? So that's another challenge. You know what I mean? A lot of the cases, once it makes the media, even if it's eligible for restorative justice diversion, sometimes politics get in the way of it and the case won't be referred to us. Even if the person harmed wants to engage in a restorative process, sometimes the will of the person harmed isn't respected, even though the system, positions itself as fighting for or representing the will or the needs of the victims. A lot of times the person who was victimized wants a restorative process, but won't even get it. And so the challenges are funding, it's doing this work on the fringe, it's people not knowing about restorative justice because it's a new, not entirely new, because it's actually old. The systems process is really what's new. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, we just need to raise public consciousness about it and get more support in scaling up this work. Out of 168 hours a week, we might meet a young person for one, in our process. And so we take them through a process, workshops and do this meaningful work encourage them to explore accountability in really creative ways, but then they have to go back out into the socially toxic environments that they live in, that the crime and the harm happened in, for the other 167 hours until they see us again next week. And so we're really trying to like pull off a miracle. It's unsustainable this way. And that's one of the reasons why I just got increasingly frustrated at my role with Healing Futures and why I'm with the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth now, because I started seeing this problem facing our youth as our youth. I illustrate it by this vision. I see our young people on a conveyor belt feeding them into a furnace. And while with restorative justice diversion, we might be able to snatch one young person off here and another young person off there and another young person off here. For every young person we successfully snatch off the conveyor belt, we watched 100 and maybe 1,000 more get fed into the fire. You know what I'm saying? And I knew we needed to scale up this work. And so right now, as the Transformative Healing and Restorative Justice manager for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, is positioning me to help amplify, bolster, and help build these models across the country, because I think it's direly needed that we scale up this work and build it to an institutional level.
Thank you, Gani. That's wonderful to hear that at a national level, we make a bigger impact. So I'm excited to kind of see what happens. But also thank you for bringing up the funding piece. I mean, that's really important. A lot of these organizations that do this work, they're not funded by the state or have, even consistent funding. So that's another, I think, recommendation we can make to anybody who's looking to support this work in their community. Maybe if you have monetary means or time that you can volunteer to do this work within your community, that is very helpful. And Belinda, so what kind of, you've been doing this work for a while, are there any challenges that you routinely face and I'm sure you've overcome them?
Well, we work to overcome. I'll say that we work to overcome. And I think every challenge that has been, or barrier and challenge that has been stated today, I have dealt with or deal with on a continuous basis. And the overcoming part has to do with the collective. I cannot say enough, while I'm here on this panel, I don't do this alone at the DRC. There are people who stand with me, who believe in our mission, who believe in our vision. That group is growing with staff, volunteers, and community supporters, and I need every one of them, young and old, rich or poor, the unique skills and talents, the person who understands data comes to the table, the person who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who is connected with a foundation, encourage us to apply, the person who will stage a fundraiser in support of this work, the person who at their congregation will ask for a special collection. We have experienced all of those things, and it's still not enough. Because when you compare it to your county budget, your city budget, wherever your law enforcement budget is positioned, your court budget, your prosecutor budget, your defense budget, when you look at all of that money collectively, and they can't fix this problem, that means that we on the ground need so much more in order to tackle it. And we know what we're doing. We have the evidence now to say that it's effective. We know that it's effective. So all of the things that have been said will constantly be a barrier until we start thinking as a society about what justice means in my community. And how do we advocate, approach, and challenge those decision makers and decision influencers on how budgets are established, made, and operationalized in a community. The money is there. It's how it's distributed. The money is there. It's how it's distributed. And we have to be brave enough and courageous and have the time and energy to challenge that. So in your community, start thinking about the skills, talents, and treasures that your community has, and how to mobilize and energize folks to do one aspect of what's needed to create a community that is restorative. So those who can talk to the political leaders and the financial leaders in your community, they need to be at the table. We need to sing from the same sheet music, be on one accord, but we all have a role to play if we truly believe in this work and we want this work to thrive. Sustainability is always on my mind. I'm always worried, right now, we appear to have enough to get us through the next 4 years at my DRC. And I deal with the budget aspect of this every month, 4 years. So I am worried about year 5. Do we stop? If we keep going, how do we do it? So right now we're talking about who to talk to and how to mobilize so that we can go beyond the 4 years. You have to be able to work in that way in order to sustain it, because as Ghani said, we're still losing too many people to the system. We need to be able to have a bigger tent, a bigger collective to make this work thrive in a more sustainable way.
So much, Belinda. Yeah, looking into the future, very important too, making sure that the work can keep happening, well into the future, and you can still bring restorative practices, as well as diversion and using it for diversion. That's important. So, oh, sorry, Ghani, you had your.
Yeah, just real quick. We got to also put an exclamation mark on the soft on crime, the perception of restorative justice being soft on crime. That's a big challenge, and that's something that's promoted by the proponents of the carceral process. Restorative justice is this kumbaya, flowery fluff, soft on crime approach, when it couldn't be further from the truth. Actually, the carceral process is soft on crime. It's hard on human beings, it's hard on people, but it's soft on crime itself. Restorative justice is a very, very intense process. In the Healing Futures process and the restorative justice diversion programs all around the country, like for instance, Common Justice, they meet with their responsible parties 5 times a week. Now we couldn't do it at Healing Futures because it's very costly, and that goes back to the funding piece. But restorative justice, it's very, very hard to explore accountability, to ask a young person to go down that rabbit hole of behind their actions, behind their harmful actions. I can't tell you how hard it is to get a young person to the point where they can build the ability, right, or tap into that thing in themselves that allows them to write an apology letter. I mean, we here as adults, we know how hard it is for some adults to make an apology. We've seen adults never give an apology for anything. We got family members. We know all of us here probably on this webinar got families that haven't even talked to each other in years, won't come to Thanksgiving dinner. And you know what I'm saying? Because they don't want to run into other family members. And if they do, it's tension in the room. Nobody will pick up the phone to be the first one to say, I'm sorry, or to resolve the difference. That's usually not even principle-based. It's really petty. You understand what I'm saying? We know this firsthand. And so for serious harm, though, especially that involves violence, right? Something that the root of it might be shame, and then shame gets piled on top of it. To go down that, to explore accountability, it can be very, very, very hard. And that's something that the system absolves people of. It's very easy. They just put people in cuffs and throw them in a cage. You know what I'm saying? They don't encourage or position the person to come face to face with the wrong that they've done, to face the person harmed, which is a very, very difficult process. And that's what restorative justice does, or restorative justice diversion processes does. So it's very, very intense, and that's a challenge that we have to get over, is addressing the myth that somehow restorative justice is soft on crime, because that belief is what dissuades a lot of people from supporting it more.
Thank you, Connie. That is a good point. That is a hard process. It's not just, restorative justice practices are not just saying, oh, it's fine, whatever happens. You're really addressing the harm and doing some hard work, and making everything restored in that way. So thank you for bringing that up. We do have a few questions from our audience here. First, a couple of comments. I just like to, one of our audience members, she shouted out to Belinda and Christine as well, just for their work with their DRCs and how instrumental it is with their training for youth circle keepers and peer mediation programs in the respective counties, and how the students, in the K through 12 setting has really benefited from that process and training. So thank you for mentioning that. And then another comment from Jermaine, who actually works with Belinda at the DRC in Washington and Livingston counties. Impact Justice is a great organization that helps communities set up diversion programs with institutional partners. They've been really instrumental at the DRC when they were first developing these programs. So Impact Justice is another organization you can look to. And our first question I'm going to go to is actually for Janelle, which relates to, I believe it was the first question we asked, what's, really drives your work and why you support it. Somebody asked, can you elaborate a little bit more on what you were talking about with behavior versus intent?
So I reflected on that question, and it can be confusing for a lot to understand, even sometimes challenging for me to articulate, because usually when we all have behaviors, those of us who are not young children and who know right from wrong, maybe I should say separate behavior from character or intent from character. But what I mean by that is every decision that we make is not always rooted in, for lack of a better term, in a devilish character. A lot of moves that we make, we're doing it and it's usually a survival factor. So for a young individual to do, let's say, a heinous crime, for example, it may be survival. I'm in a situation, the only way I can get out is if I do this. I don't really want to do this because it's not in my heart. But if I don't do this, then I'm at stake in some way. There's been a lot of cases I've seen in the last few years where it may be something that's as hard to talk about, like a sexual assault case, where you have adults who are still hurting others. But when you look deeper into their history, you learn that was a learned behavior that was never rectified through therapy, which should have started when they were much younger. So to us, they are hurting kids, they're hurting adults. But for them, and they may not even understand it, but professionals, health professionals may understand. This person is surviving. This person, in this person's mind, if I don't do this, I'm going to die. If I don't do this, someone's going to come after me in this same way, because that's all that they know. So when I say behavior versus intent, I guess I want to distinguish behavior versus the root of one's true character, in which many cases is stunted. Because I believe a lot of individuals, they don't grow to be wise. Things happen and they're stunted at age 5, they're stunted at age 12, which are very delicate ages where they are learning how to emotionally cope with a lot of events. And it's not to avoid accountability for those individuals at all. It's just to understand the reason behind their behaviors that I don't believe should always be connected to their character.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you for elaborating on that. The next question I'll direct to the DRCs. So Belinda and Christine, what suggestions do you have for getting like teachers or school administrators and other, school communities on board with this restorative justice practice, especially those, or if you do have experience with people who have maybe been, working in, traditional measures for a long time and might feel jaded about making such changes?
I mean, it's a big, multifaceted problem. Two thoughts that come to mind. One, there's usually one or more champions. It could be the superintendent, it could be a principal, Can we work with them to make sure that they're actually incorporating restorative language and restorative processes in their interactions with the people they work with the students, with the teachers, with everyone, so that they're actually using restorative practices. Another thing that comes to mind is we're really trying to promote the idea of coaching. So you train someone, they think it's a great idea, but they need support in order to bring that into the classroom, in order to bring that into their staff meetings, in order to create those problem-solving circles. So we really need to work to make not only coaching available, but available in a way so that it is not one more thing. So that if the teachers wants to do coaching, do they have to do it during their planning period? Do they have to do it after school? Like, how can we make it available so that, again, it's supporting them? So that's another thing. And then I think also just education. So just supporting the idea that there are different ways to implement restorative practices. Teachers can use it to present content. Teachers can use it to work together to talk about a student whose actions may be giving them all trouble, and how can they work together to try to support that student and help make their behavior change so that they're interacting better with other people. So I think a lot of it is just information, and again, trying to encourage people to really use the processes, not like I'm the principal and you all need to be restorative, but I'm the principal and I'm restorative in every way as much as I can be in my interactions in the community.
Yeah. And I'll add to that this work requires a cultural shift in expectations and ways of being within that school community. One of the important learnings for myself, I experience in working in the schools, is that teachers need circles themselves. They need to sit in a circle that is facilitated, where they can talk about the community, the harm that they may have experienced when a youth acted out, outburst, whatever it was. Maybe a peer may have harmed them, but teachers need circles. I think the circles can also strengthen them as a collective. I think the circle can also help them shift the culture and the ways of being in the schools, so that they begin to model and live restoratively in front of their students. Building administrators need to circle as administrators and the challenges that they face, and also with the other adults in the building. This is not something we do to or for, it's what we do together. And the more we practice it together, the easier it will feel and the more natural it will feel to be in circle. There are schools in this country where students in classrooms with their teacher, their desks are in the formation of a circle. One of the teachers is on this webinar right now. I was in her classroom just recently, maybe a couple weeks ago, and her desks are in the formation of a circle. Her students expect to circle up. Their ways of being is around respect and kindness and empathy all the time. So even when someone is off track, out of bounds, they show care and kindness to talk about what's needed, what happened as a collective. So she's created a culture in the classroom that is different from the culture outside the classroom or in other parts of the district. So it can be done. I just want folks to know it can be done. Teachers, if you can become invested enough in this emotionally to sit in circle as a participant and see what it feels like to be there, to create that vulnerability, I think you'll be more willing to give it a try in your classroom. The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm sorry, I didn't write it down, so it escaped me. The cultural aspect, the ways of being, and we also have to challenge ourselves when we look at the demographics of schools, who teaches in this country. I think one statistic is more than 80% of our teachers in this country are middle-class white women, right? If that is true, and I'm not a teacher, so if that is true, okay. If it's not true, correct me. But if that is true, and your lived experiences are rooted in a middle-class lifestyle, but you're teaching in a poor community, a rural community, an urban community, an under-resourced community, you need to get serious about what that means to you and how you show up authentically, but how you show up with grace in consideration of what those unmet needs are. Sometimes and I don't want to bash on teachers, I know I sound that I am, but I think that's a reality that we have to face. And then once we face that reality, then we start thinking about, I would suggest you start thinking about, who do you partner with? And it can be the untraditional people that you think of. People in the community where you teach have more intel and understanding about that community than you do. So how do you partner with them and build those relationships that will support restorative practices in your classroom, in your building, and in your school community? You don't have to champion this alone. No one does. Be willing to be in partnership with other folks.
Thank you so much, Belinda and Christine. Those are all great suggestions.
Katie.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No, just real quick on that. We in Healing Futures, we received quite a few cases from that should not have even made it to Healing Futures. I'm talking about that should have been resolved in the principal's office or in a circle process in the school, for fights where someone might have gotten hurt, and I remember fights, unfortunately, is a thing that happens at school, and it had ways of being resolved, in the principal's office, the dean's office, or whatever the case may be. But now, the response is to slap handcuffs on the youngest person we got was 12 years old in our Healing Futures program, and I'm trying to imagine a 12-year-old in a pair of handcuffs facing criminal charges, right? We should be ashamed of ourselves, as a society, right? I'm thinking about Nelson Mandela's quote, as I'm talking to you, and I thought about it as I saw this young person, and every young person that I came in contact with in the Restorative Justice Diversion Program, and where Nelson Mandela said, there is no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children. And so right now, this conversation that we're having and the work that we're talking about doing is about the health of the soul of this society, right? And that's one of the reasons why we really prioritize pre-charge cases in Healing Futures, because a lot of these cases we believe shouldn't have even been charged. You know what I'm saying? This stuff used to be resolved in school. And so all of these schools around the country need to have restorative justice diversion in the school, to also teach the children about not just resolving harm and trespasses against each other, but about one of the previous questions you had, Katie, about how do we begin to educate the community about accountability and educate young people about accountability. We need to start teaching about accountability in school, and about accountability not as this thing to be afraid of, like it's synonymous with punishment, but make it as favorable a term. Young people like using the term freedom and independence. Oh, and also probably the most popular one is, oh, I'm grown, right? We need to make young people feel just as good about saying I'm accountable, right, as they are with saying I'm grown, right? And I want to be free, or I want to be independent. And that's with really making a definition or an understanding or perspective on accountability a part of the educational curriculum.
You, Gani. Yeah, we have a couple folks that are seconding you and agreeing with that what you said. So we have about a minute or so. So just really briefly, I do want to address the last question we have. Someone said a huge barrier to widespread support of restorative justice is a belief system that punishment, when you're mad or a harm is committed, will make you feel better as the person harmed, or that person will make that person stop. So just from each of you, is there one idea you can give to help people and systems challenge this belief. So we have just about a minute left until noon. So just very briefly, of maybe one idea to help challenge this. And Belinda, you can go first.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and it's just really to underscore and reiterate what Ghani has already said. I do recommend reading Until We Reckon. I think it's a lot of content there that will challenge these beliefs and gives a voice to those who have been harmed. If you haven't talked to a victim before, you can hear at least some their voices in that book. So I would suggest that.
Thank you, Belinda. And Janelle, I'll go to you. Just one idea for kind of overcoming those traditional beliefs.
I would say what I mentioned before is working on broadening perspectives from a lot of youth. And for the generations that are not yet born, having available to them resources that can hone a broad perspective in them at a very, very early age, because young children are very, very perceptive and they learn and adapt very quickly.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. And Ghani, just quickly, one idea for maybe challenging those belief systems.
I could just say, as we collectively vision what we want to see in the place of what we have, it's important to not lose sight of what we have. Michigan, for instance, has the largest population of condemned children on the planet Earth. We're supporting a bill, SB 119, HB 4160 to 64, that would abolish life without parole or death by incarceration for people 18 years of age and younger and make them eligible for parole. So bills like this have already proven successful in 28 other states, including Arkansas, Ohio, Nevada, and West Virginia. And we still have time to pass these bills during the last few weeks of 2024 if leadership will make them a priority. So if we're talking about restorative justice, and we're also not talking about abolishing the condemnation of children to death by incarceration / life without parole, then I don't really know what we're talking about.
Thank you for bringing that up, Ghani. That's a good point. Restorative justice processes within state policy. Also, advocating for that is important. And lastly, Christine, what are a couple or maybe just one idea for challenging a more traditional punitive approach?
I think it's just trying to have those conversations and sharing the experiences of people who have been harmed and healed during restorative practices. What have they learned and how have they gotten what they need in a way that didn't involve punishment or retribution?
Excellent point. Those are all good suggestions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists and for making time to join us today and offer their perspectives. I think this has been a great conversation to start about, how we redefine accountability, especially using restorative practices. And thank you so much to our attendees for joining us today and, being open to learning more about restorative justice. Stay tuned. We might have some more conversations. There's also going to actually Belinda and Christine through their DRCs are gonna next year be hosting a restorative justice conference in November. So if you're in the state of Michigan, keep your eye out for that. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be blessed, everyone.
Everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.